Daniel Harper had lived alone for almost 3 years when the first note appeared beneath his front door. At first, he assumed it had blown in somehow. The old cottage he rented sat at the edge of a quiet village where the wind found its way through every crack and corner. In winter, the windows rattled softly at night, and when the rain came, the path outside gleamed silver beneath the street lamp. It was the sort of place where very little ever happened, which was perhaps why the note unsettled him. He noticed it late on a Thursday evening after returning home from work. The house was cold, as usual, and he dropped his keys into the little ceramic bowl beside the door before switching on the lamp in the sitting room. That was when he saw it. A small cream envelope lying neatly on the floorboards. Not crumpled, not damp, placed. Daniel frowned. He was certain it had not been there that morning. He bent down and picked it up. There was no stamp, no address, only 4 carefully written words on the front in neat blue ink. Please don't miss Thursday. Daniel stared at it for longer than he cared to admit. Thursday? Today was Thursday. Well, he muttered quietly to the empty room, that's not particularly helpful. The silence that followed felt strangely loud. Daniel lived alone, and had for long enough that he had grown used to talking to himself sometimes. Not conversations exactly, just small comments made to no one. The kettle taking too long, the weather, a missing sock, the sorts of things people never notice until there is nobody else there to hear them. He turned the envelope over. Still nothing. No clue who had left it. Slowly, he slid one finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single folded sheet. The handwriting matched the envelope. Neat, careful, oddly familiar somehow. It read, "Tomorrow, leave for work 10 minutes earlier than usual. And whatever you do, don't miss the 8:12 train." Daniel frowned. Someone had gone to an awful lot of effort for a very strange joke. He folded the paper and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then he made tea. That should have been the end of it. Normally, he would have forgotten something odd like that by morning. But all evening, he found himself glancing toward the folded note. Every now and then, the thought returned. How does someone know which train I catch? He had never mentioned it to anyone. Not recently, anyway. His routine had become small and predictable over the years. Wake up, tea, train, work, home, repeat. Sometimes he wondered if life had quietly shrunk without him noticing. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The cottage felt colder than usual. At around midnight, while brushing his teeth, another thought drifted quietly into his mind. One he could not quite shake. How had anyone delivered the note? The front gate always creaked, loudly, the sort of creak impossible to miss. Yet he had heard nothing. No knock, no footsteps, nothing at all. The next morning, Daniel stood in the kitchen holding his coffee and staring at the folded paper. It was ridiculous, completely ridiculous. And yet, at exactly 7:48, he picked up his coat. 10 minutes earlier than usual, Daniel told himself he was only leaving early to prove a point. That was all. Not because he believed the note. Certainly not because some strange feeling in his chest had followed him all morning. And absolutely not because, sometime during the night, he had caught himself wondering who still wrote messages by hand. The village streets were unusually quiet as he walked toward the station. Rainwater shimmered in the cracks of the pavement, and the bakery on the corner had only just begun opening its shutters. Usually, Daniel passed it too late to smell fresh bread. Today, warm air drifted into the cold morning. For some reason, it made him feel unexpectedly sad. Little things had changed in recent years. Tiny routines lost without noticing. He used to stop there on Fridays, back when there had been someone to take pastries home to. He pushed the thought aside. The station sat half hidden beneath old trees, small and tired-looking, with peeling paint around the benches and flower pots. No one seemed to water anymore. The clock read 8:05. Plenty of time. Daniel almost laughed at himself. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, feeling faintly foolish. Then movement caught his eye. An elderly woman stood near the far bench, struggling with two heavy shopping bags. One slipped suddenly from her hand. Oranges rolled across the platform. "Oh, for goodness sake," she sighed. Before he had really thought about it, Daniel was already moving. "Here," he said, crouching down. "Let me help." Together, they gathered the runaway fruit. "You're very kind," the woman said warmly. "I'm not usually," Daniel replied before he could stop himself. To his surprise, she laughed. "You look exactly like someone who says things like that." There was something oddly familiar about her smile, comforting somehow. When the train finally arrived, Daniel helped her aboard. "You heading into the city?" he asked. "No," she said, settling into her seat. "Just one stop." She hesitated, then added quietly, "But I'm glad you caught this train." Something about the way she said it made him pause. Before he could ask what she meant, she reached into her handbag. "I nearly forgot," she said. "This is for you." Daniel frowned. "For me?" She nodded and handed him a cream envelope. His stomach dropped. The same cream paper, the same neat blue handwriting. His name. He looked up sharply, but the woman was already staring out of the rain-speckled window as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Slowly, Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands, his pulse suddenly louder than the sound of the train. He opened it carefully. Inside was another folded note. Only 5 words this time. "Do not get off early." Daniel stared at the message. A strange, cold feeling settled quietly in his chest. 'Cause he hadn't told anyone. But for the last 3 years, he had been getting off the train one stop early. Daniel read the note 3 times. "Do not get off early." The train hummed softly beneath him as rain streaked the windows in silver lines. Across the aisle, the elderly woman sat quietly, hands folded in her lap as though she had not just handed a complete stranger a deeply unsettling message. Daniel looked up. "Excuse me," he said carefully. The woman turned. "Yes?" "This note." He hesitated. "Who gave it to you?" Her expression softened. "Oh," she said gently. "Someone asked me to pass it along." "Who?" But something strange happened then. The woman frowned slightly. "I'm not quite sure," she admitted. Daniel blinked. "You're not sure?" "I know that sounds odd," she said with a small, embarrassed laugh. "I met someone yesterday afternoon. Very kind. We spoke for a while." She paused. "But isn't that funny? I suddenly can't seem to remember their face." A little shiver moved through him. "That's impossible," Daniel said. "Yes," she replied quietly. "I thought so too." Then she smiled again. "But they seemed very certain you'd be here." Before Daniel could ask another question, the train slowed. The woman stood. "My stop," she said. At the doors, she turned back. "Oh," she added thoughtfully. "They asked me to tell you something else." Daniel frowned. What? Her expression grew strangely serious. Please stop blaming yourself. Then the doors opened, and she was gone. Daniel sat completely still. The train pulled away. His chest felt oddly tight. Please stop blaming yourself. The words landed somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere old, somewhere he preferred not to visit. He stared out at the passing streets. Whoever this person was, they knew things. Things no stranger should know. And somehow, against all logic, they seemed to understand him. He almost got off at the next stop anyway. Habit. For almost 3 years, he'd been getting off the train, one stop early, to avoid the lakeside road entirely. He told himself it was for fresh air. But really, he had been avoiding the street near the florist, avoiding the small cafe nearby, avoiding memories. It had been easier that way. His fingers tightened around the folded note. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And yet, he stayed on the train. 1 stop longer. 2. When he finally stepped out at his normal station, something immediately felt wrong. Or perhaps different. A crowd had gathered near the station entrance. People standing still. Quiet. Daniel almost walked around them. Then he saw why. An elderly man sat on the pavement looking pale and shaken beside an overturned bicycle. Someone nearby was speaking hurriedly into a phone. He just collapsed, a woman said. Ambulance is coming. Daniel recognized him instantly. Mr. Lawson, the caretaker from the office building next to his. Every morning for years, they had nodded politely to one another. Nothing more. Just one of those tiny, familiar faces life quietly gives you. Without really thinking, Daniel stepped forward. You all right? He asked gently. The older man looked up, dazed. Oh, he whispered. Bit embarrassing, this. Daniel gave a small smile. Don't worry about that. So he stayed. He fetched water, waited with him, talked quietly while the ambulance came. And when the paramedic finally stood up, she smiled at Daniel. Good thing someone stayed with him, she said. He was very frightened. Daniel nodded, but something strange settled over him then. A quiet thought. One he didn't particularly want. If he had gotten off the train early, like he had every other day, he would never have been there. That evening, he walked home through cold air with an uncomfortable feeling sitting heavily in his chest. The house felt different somehow when he opened the door. Quieter. Waiting. And there, resting neatly on the floorboards, was another cream envelope. This time, his hands trembled slightly before he picked it up. On the front were 6 words. Tomorrow. Take the long way home. Daniel stood in the hallway for a long moment. The cream envelope felt strangely heavy in his hand. Outside, evening rain whispered softly against the windows. The cottage creaked around him. Quiet, still, waiting. Slowly, he turned the envelope over. Nothing on the back. No clue. No explanation. Only those 6 words written neatly across the front. Tomorrow. Take the long way home. He let out a quiet breath. No, he said aloud. Absolutely not. This had already gone far enough. The train note had been unsettling enough. The woman who couldn't remember who gave it to her. The strange message about blame. And now this? Someone somehow knowing his routines? It was ridiculous. Impossible. And yet, part of him already knew what would happen. Tomorrow evening, he would take the long way home. Because curiosity had quietly settled inside him now. And because, whether he liked it or not, The notes had been right. That night, sleep came badly. Daniel woke twice, once convinced he had heard something at the front door, the second time because of a dream he had not had in months. A bench, rain, someone laughing softly beside him. Then silence. The next day dragged. Work felt distant somehow. Numbers blurred on the computer screen. Conversations floated past him unnoticed. More than once, he found himself checking the clock, thinking about the note. By 5 o'clock, dark clouds had already begun gathering overhead. He stood outside the office building, pulling on his coat. The short route home lay to the left. Familiar, quick, safe. The long route wound through the old park, past the lake, past places he'd quietly stopped visiting, places he had spent years avoiding. Daniel sighed. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Still, he turned right. The park was quieter than he remembered. Cold leaves shifted softly beneath his shoes. The trees stood dark against the fading sky. Everything felt strangely familiar, like walking through an old memory. He had not been here in nearly 3 years, not since... His thoughts stopped there, as they always did, halfway. The lake came into view through the trees, still, silver, peaceful, and there it was, the bench, exactly where he remembered. Daniel slowed. Something tightened painfully in his chest. For a second, he almost turned around. But then he noticed something resting carefully on the wooden seat. A cream envelope. Waiting. His footsteps slowed. The air suddenly felt colder. Nobody nearby. No sound except distant wind moving through branches. Slowly, he reached for it. Hands strangely unsteady. Inside was another note. Only 3 words this time. "Please sit a while." Daniel stared at the lake, at the bench, at the place he had spent every Thursday evening for years. Before. Back when Thursdays had meant something. Back when someone had still been sitting beside him. Slowly, hesitantly, he sat down. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel allowed himself to remember. For a long while, Daniel simply sat. The lake stretched quietly before him, smooth as glass beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere nearby, ducks shifted softly in the reeds. The air smelled faintly of rain and memory. Funny how places held things, as though moments never fully left, as though laughter somehow stayed tucked between trees, waiting quietly for someone brave enough to return. Daniel swallowed hard. 3 years. 3 years. And he had not sat on this bench. Not once. Because this had been their place. Every Thursday. Without fail. No matter how busy life became. No matter the weather. Sarah had insisted on it. Everyone deserves one evening that belongs only to them, she used to say. Tea in paper cups. The lake. Talking about nothing important. Everything important. He had loved Thursdays. Until he hadn't. Daniel rubbed tiredly at his eyes. Funny. He had spent years trying not to think about her. As though grief were something you could quietly outwalk. As though avoiding memories somehow hurt less than carrying them. But sitting there now, he realized something uncomfortable. Avoiding her had not stopped missing her. It had only made the missing lonelier. Wind moved softly through the trees. Then, a voice. "Still sitting too stiffly, I see." Daniel froze, his breath caught. Slowly, almost afraid to, he turned. An older man stood beside the path. Gray coat, kind eyes, perhaps late 70s. He smiled warmly. "You must be Daniel." Daniel frowned. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "Do I know you?" The man chuckled softly. No, he said, but someone who loved you very much did. Something shifted uncomfortably inside him. The man nodded toward the bench. She talked about Thursdays often. Daniel stood abruptly. Who are you? The stranger hesitated, then reached carefully into his coat pocket and held out a cream envelope. Daniel's stomach dropped. No, he said quietly. No, I'm done with this. The man's expression softened. I know, he said gently, but she hoped you might finally be ready. Daniel stared, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. She? He whispered. The old man offered the envelope. Daniel took it slowly, hands trembling now. The familiar neat blue writing waited inside. Only 5 words. You stayed? Thank you? His throat tightened painfully, because somehow, some impossibly ridiculous way, the handwriting looked familiar. Not just familiar, known, loved. His breath caught. No, that wasn't possible. Slowly, carefully, almost afraid to, he unfolded the second page, tucked behind it, and stopped breathing entirely. Because across the top, written in handwriting he had not seen for 3 years, were the words, Hello, love. If you're reading this, Daniel stared at the paper. His hands trembled. The world around him seemed strangely quiet. The lake, the wind, the distant sound of someone walking a dog far beyond the trees. Everything suddenly felt far away, because the handwriting on the page belonged to Sarah. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. And yet, there it was, the little curl at the end of her Y's, the way she pressed slightly harder on certain letters. Tiny things no stranger could copy. No stranger would even notice. His throat tightened painfully. Slowly, carefully, he began to read. Hello, love. If you're reading this, then you finally sat on the bench again. Good. It's about time. You always were stubborn. And if you're muttering under your breath right now, I was expecting that too. Daniel let out the smallest sound, half laugh, half something dangerously close to breaking. It sounded like her, not just the handwriting, the voice, the rhythm. Sarah had always teased him gently when life grew too heavy, even when she herself had been frightened. He swallowed hard and kept reading. I know what you've been doing. Avoiding Thursdays, avoiding the lake, taking different routes home. And sweetheart, you really must stop blaming yourself. Daniel lowered the paper. His eyes burned suddenly. No, she couldn't know that. Couldn't possibly know. The old man beside the path remained quietly still, giving him space, as though he somehow understood this moment belonged entirely to Daniel. Slowly, Daniel read on. If you're angry reading this, I understand. And if you're crying, I understand that too. But before you decide this is all too strange and walk away, let me explain. When I became ill and things were uncertain, I asked some people to help me. Daniel blinked. The words blurred briefly. He wiped his eyes. Read again. I knew you. Better than anyone. I knew what would happen. You would shrink your life. You would become lonely. You would quietly stop living while pretending you were simply carrying on. And I couldn't bear the thought of that. Daniel stopped, breathing suddenly difficult, because every word felt uncomfortably true. The small routines, the silence, the shrinking life. Tea for one. No Thursdays. No bakery. No bench. No joy if he were honest. Just surviving. He had not realized how small things had become until someone had written them down. So I made arrangements. Letters, notes, tiny nudges, Nothing too dramatic. You hate dramatic things. I just hope that one day you'd trust me enough to follow them." Daniel laughed then, a proper laugh this time, wet-eyed and shaky, because yes, he hated dramatic things. And yes, this was absolutely something Sarah would do. Complicated, thoughtful, impossible to ignore. The old man shifted gently. "She asked me to wait," he said quietly. Daniel looked up. "You knew her?" He smiled softly. "Hospital volunteer," he said. "We became friends." Daniel looked back at the page. One final paragraph waited at the bottom. Short, simple, written smaller than the rest, as though it mattered most. "One more thing, love. Tomorrow, buy the cinnamon pastry. Trust me." Daniel let out a quiet laugh through tears, because for 12 years, Sarah had ordered the exact same pastry every Friday morning. And somehow, for the first time in years, the thought no longer hurt quite so much. Daniel sat very still. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. The sky had darkened while he'd been reading. Lamps along the path flickered softly to life, their reflections stretching across the lake. For a moment, he forgot where he was, forgot the cold, forgot the old man standing patiently nearby, because all he could hear was Sarah. Not truly hear, of course, but somehow, through the careful rhythm of her words, the teasing warmth, the way she somehow always knew exactly what he needed before he did. Slowly, he looked back down at the page. "I should explain. And before you start muttering about me being dramatic, yes, I know. But one advantage of being poorly is that people suddenly let you organize things. And, as you know, I've never been particularly bad at organizing things." Daniel laughed quietly through his nose. That part was painfully true. Sarah had organized everything. Birthdays, trips, bills, even the kitchen cupboards. He once moved the mugs to a different shelf. She had found them in under 30 seconds. "The truth is, love, I was frightened. Not so much for me, for you. Because I knew what grief might do to someone who loves deeply and talks very little about how he feels." Daniel lowered the paper for a moment. The words landed harder than he expected, because he had loved deeply. Still did. That had never been the problem. The problem was surviving the empty space afterward, the strange quiet, the shape grief left behind. So I made arrangements, little nudges, nothing too overwhelming. You'd hate that. Just enough to gently annoy you back into living. Daniel smiled despite himself. "Sounds like you," he murmured. The old man nearby gave a small, knowing smile but said nothing. Daniel kept reading. "I asked several people for help. You'll meet some of them. Please be kind to them, and no suspicious faces. You have a terribly suspicious face when confused." He laughed again, a proper laugh this time, small, unexpected, and strangely good. 3 years. 3 years since laughter had arrived without guilt attached to it. At the bottom of the page was one final paragraph, smaller than the others, as though written carefully, thoughtfully. "You are allowed to miss me. But sweetheart, you are not allowed to stop living because I'm gone." Daniel stopped reading. Something shifted painfully inside him, because suddenly, uncomfortably, he realized she had been right. He had stopped, not all at once, quietly, gradually, like winter arriving unnoticed. Smaller life, smaller days, fewer places, less joy, as though surviving was somehow loyalty, as though happiness meant leaving her behind. He swallowed hard, then noticed something tucked into the back of the envelope. one final folded note, smaller than the others, on the front written neatly, "For tomorrow morning." Daniel frowned. Slowly, carefully, he opened it. Inside were just 5 words. "Say yes when she asks." Daniel blinked. "She?" he whispered aloud. The old man smiled gently. "Oh," he said. Now, that one caused quite the debate. Daniel looked up sharply. What does that mean? But the old man only adjusted his coat. "I suppose," he said warmly, "you'll find out tomorrow." Daniel slept badly. Not because he was frightened. Not exactly. His mind simply refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, something returned. Sarah's handwriting, the old man, the impossible kindness of it all. And those 5 words, "Say yes when she asks." 5 words, no explanation, no clue, just another mystery. By morning, rain had cleared. Cold sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor while the kettle boiled. Daniel stood staring absently out the window. For the first time in years, Thursday evening had not felt unbearable, strange, uncomfortable, but somehow lighter. He found himself thinking about the bench, about Sarah laughing, about cinnamon pastries. The memories still hurt, but less sharply somehow, as though someone had quietly opened a window in a room that had stayed shut too long. At 7:38, he left for work, and without really meaning to. He stopped at the bakery. The warm smell hit him instantly. Butter, coffee, fresh bread, memories. He almost turned around. But then, "Daniel?" He looked up. A woman stood behind the counter, late 30s perhaps, dark hair tied loosely back, friendly face, familiar somehow. She smiled uncertainly. "I thought that was you." Daniel frowned politely. "I'm sorry." "Oh, goodness," she laughed softly. "Of course, it's been ages." She hesitated. "I'm Emma." And then he remembered. Not well, but enough. Sarah's friend from years ago, the one who used to come for dinner sometimes, the one Sarah always claimed secretly gave terrible life advice. "You told Sarah to quit her job and open a cheese shop," Daniel said suddenly. Emma burst out laughing. "Oh, dear," she said. She remembered that. She thought it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous, Emma admitted. Daniel found himself smiling. Strange. He had not expected his morning to feel normal. Yet somehow, it did. For a moment, like life had accidentally forgotten to feel heavy. Emma glanced toward the pastry shelves. "You still buying the cinnamon swirls?" Daniel paused, because suddenly, very suddenly, he remembered the note. "Trust me." His stomach flipped strangely. "No," he said slowly. "Actually," and before he could stop himself, "yes." Emma smiled warmly. "Good," then hesitated. "I was wondering, actually." She looked awkward suddenly, unexpectedly nervous. "There's a little charity market at the lake on Saturday." Daniel blinked. The lake. He had not gone there in years before yesterday. "My volunteers canceled," Emma continued, "and I remember Sarah saying you used to be annoyingly reliable." Daniel opened his mouth, ready to politely refuse, obviously, because crowds and people and effort. Then, like someone quietly nudging him, he remembered the note. 5 words, clear as anything. "Say yes when she asks." Daniel let out the smallest sigh, half disbelief, half surrender. "Yes," he said. Emma blinked. "Oh, you don't have to sound surprised," Daniel said dryly. She laughed. "No, sorry. I just expected at least 3 excuses first." Something unfamiliar flickered inside him then. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps the smallest beginning of something. As he turned to leave, Emma called after him. "Oh, And Daniel? He looked back. She smiled softly. There's something Sarah wanted me to give you? His heart stopped for a second. Emma disappeared into the back room and returned holding another cream envelope. Daniel stared at the envelope. The cream paper looked almost ordinary now, almost familiar, still impossible, still unsettling, and yet somehow comforting too. Emma held it out carefully. She asked me to wait, she said quietly, for when you were ready. Daniel swallowed. Ready for what? Emma gave the smallest shrug. That part, she said softly. She never really explained. Slowly, Daniel took the envelope. The familiar, neat handwriting rested on the front. Only 4 words. Not all at once. He let out a quiet breath. That sounds like her, he murmured. Emma smiled sadly. Yes, she said. It really does. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Emma nodded toward the pastry bag. You should probably eat that before life becomes unbearably meaningful. Daniel laughed unexpectedly. A proper laugh, the sort that arrived before sadness had chance to stop it. Still terrible advice? He asked. Consistently terrible, she replied. And somehow, without meaning to, the morning felt lighter. At work, Daniel waited until lunch before opening the envelope. He sat alone on a bench outside the office, coat buttoned against the cold. Carefully, he unfolded the paper inside. Only 1 page, written in Sarah's familiar hand. Hello, love. By now you've probably figured out I may have organized a ridiculous amount of your future. You're welcome. Also, before you complain, yes, I know this is all slightly dramatic, but grief is heavy, and I knew you'd try carrying it alone. You always try carrying everything alone. Daniel smiled sadly. That part hurt because it was true. I need you to understand something. Missing me is not betrayal. Laughing again is not betrayal. Feeling happy sometimes is not betrayal either. You do not have to stay sad to prove that you loved me. Daniel stopped reading. The words landed somewhere deep. Because perhaps, if he were honest, that was exactly what he had been doing. Holding on to sadness, as though letting go of it somehow meant letting go of her. Slowly, he kept reading. I have one last favor to ask. Saturday, the lake. Please go. Stay until the end. And sweetheart, when the time comes, please don't leave early. That was it. No explanation. No reason. Just trust. Saturday arrived colder than expected. Gray skies, sharp wind. Daniel nearly didn't go. Twice, in fact. By 10 o'clock, he'd convinced himself it would be awkward. By 11, unnecessary. By 11:30, ridiculous. And yet, just after noon, he found himself walking toward the lake carrying folding chairs for Emma. Look who actually turned up, she said. You sound surprised again. I am. The afternoon passed strangely easily. Tea, small conversations, helping people, children feeding ducks, nothing dramatic, nothing life-changing. Just life, ordinary life. And somehow, Daniel realized how long it had been since he had stood inside it, instead of watching from the outside. As evening settled, stalls began packing away. The lake turned silver beneath soft, fading light. Daniel picked up his coat, ready to leave, then paused. The note. Please don't leave early. He sighed quietly. Fine, he muttered toward the sky. You win? Emma laughed from nearby. You talking to yourself? Long story. Good story? He hesitated. Then, for the first time in years, he answered honestly. Actually, yes. A few minutes later, someone climbed onto the small wooden stage near the lake. "Before everyone goes," the organizer said warmly, "we wanted to unveil something special." A cloth slipped away, and Daniel stopped breathing, because there, beside the water, stood a bench, new wood, small brass plaque, and, written across it, "For Sarah, who always made Thursdays feel special." Daniel stared, unable to move. Then beneath it, smaller writing, words he recognized instantly, words he had not heard in years. "Everyone deserves one evening that belongs only to them." His knees nearly gave way, because suddenly he understood. The notes, the bench, the lake, the nudges. It had never been about moving on. It had been about coming back. Back to life. Back to himself. Back to Thursdays. A hand touched his arm gently. "Emma. She organized this," Emma said softly. "Before things got bad." Daniel laughed shakily through tears. "That woman? She was impossible," Emma said warmly. "Yes," Daniel whispered. "She really was." Then something caught his eye. Resting quietly on the bench, one final cream envelope. For a long moment, Daniel simply stared. The final cream envelope rested quietly against the wood of the bench, waiting, as though it had always known he would eventually arrive here. The evening air had turned colder. Around him, people folded tables, packed boxes, laughed softly in tired voices. Life moving, ordinary, gentle. But for Daniel, everything seemed strangely still. Emma squeezed his arm lightly. "I think," she said softly, "that one's probably meant for you alone." He nodded, unable to speak. Slowly, he sat down on the bench. Their bench. Or perhaps, he realized suddenly, still their bench. Just differently now. His fingers trembled as he picked up the envelope. On the front, in Sarah's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. "One last thing, love." Daniel let out a shaky laugh. "Of course there is," he murmured. Carefully, he opened it. Inside was one final letter, slightly longer than the others, folded neatly. He unfolded it slowly and began to read. "Hello, love. If you're here, then firstly, well done. You followed instructions far better than I expected, though I imagine there was at least some muttering involved. I hope you bought the cinnamon pastry, and I hope you finally stopped taking the shorter route home. Honestly, Daniel, grief may be unavoidable, but terrible shortcuts are not." He laughed softly through tears, because yes, there had been muttering. A lot of muttering. He kept reading. "Now comes the important bit. You have spent long enough being lonely. And before you roll your eyes, no, I am not trying to set you up with anyone. This isn't one of those stories. I simply need you to understand something. You did not fail me. You loved me beautifully. Right until the end. Even when you were frightened. Even when I was frightened. You stayed. And if I carried any sadness with me, it was only that I knew how hard you would find the quiet afterwards." Daniel stopped. The tears came then, quietly, without warning, because for 3 years, he had carried something heavy, something he had never said aloud, that maybe he should have done more, seen more, fixed something, saved her somehow. But Sarah, being Sarah, had somehow reached through time just to take that weight from him. He wiped his eyes and read on. "There is something I need you to promise me. Not tomorrow, not next week. Whenever you're ready. Say yes to things again. Tea with people. Walks you nearly avoid. Bad advice from Emma. Thursday evenings. Ordinary happiness. because loving me was never supposed to become the end of your story. You are still here. And sweetheart, I still need you to live like it. By now, the words blurred. He had to stop twice to breathe, twice to steady himself. At the very bottom of the page, one final sentence, smaller than the rest, as though quietly tucked there, waiting. P.S. I moved the mugs to the wrong cupboard. You never noticed. Daniel laughed then, a proper laugh, wet-eyed, broken and whole all at once. Because of course she had. Of course. He looked out across the lake, the evening light shimmering softly on the water, the bench beside him no longer unbearable, still sad. Perhaps always a little sad, but warm somehow too, full. And for the first time in years, Daniel realized something surprising. He could miss Sarah and still feel life gently waiting for him. Emma appeared beside the bench, quietly, no pressure, no interruption. "Fancy a tea?" she asked. Daniel looked at the lake, then at the bench, then up at the darkening sky. And somewhere, deep down, something shifted, small, tender, hopeful. He smiled, and this time, when life asked, he said yes.